A light drizzle wrapped New York City in a thin veil, transforming it into a realm of shadows and reflections. Cars glided silently down the wet streets, leaving trails of spray in their wake. Pedestrians hurried under umbrellas, quickening their pace to escape the dampness. Away from the city's bustle, there was a small, well-kept park. Amid its trees and stone paths stood an old cemetery, cloaked in a stillness that sharply contrasted with the urban noise. Jonathan Harris, a tall man with sharp, resolute features, stood before a gravestone. His black overcoat stood out against the gray, rainy day, and the tailored suit beneath hinted at his status. Yet, none of that mattered now. On the stone in front of him was a name: Emily Harris, 1984 to 2022. Simple letters that tore at his heart every time he looked at them. Emily had been his everything. Her death in a car accident 2 years ago was a blow he had never recovered from. He remembered that night vividly. The call, the cold, detached voice of the officer delivering the news. It echoed endlessly in his mind, as if replayed on an endless loop. From that moment, Jonathan's life had become a haze. The days blurred together, and the nights were endless nightmares. He hadn't just lost his wife, he'd lost the very meaning of his existence. Today was another day he had come here to quiet his pain. He knelt before the grave and gently placed a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flowers. His hands trembled as he adjusted the stems to make them perfectly even. He was meticulous about this, as though such small details could bring her some comfort. "Hi, Em," he began softly, his voice steady but laced with suppressed grief. "I'm here again. Sorry I couldn't make it yesterday. I had a meeting. You'd laugh at me. I still hate speaking in front of people. But I managed. Your advice is still with me." He paused, brushing away a few fallen leaves from the grave. It felt like she could hear him. Or maybe he just needed to believe that she could. "You know, Em, I dreamt about you last night. You were wearing that green dress, the one that always made your eyes shine. You were smiling." His voice faltered for a moment. "I don't want to wake up when you're there with me." Raindrops trickled down his face, mingling with the rare tears he allowed himself to shed. Jonathan was a strong man, used to carrying burdens on his own, but the loss of Emily was a wound that refused to heal. After a long silence, he rose to his feet, running his hand over the cold stone. His gaze lingered on the date of her death. Memories flooded back, of the future they had planned together. A house by the coast, adventures around the world, children. All of it now seemed unreachable. As he left the cemetery, he cast one last glance at the grave. The rain continued to fall, as though even the sky mourned with him. But this time, instead of the usual emptiness that followed his visits, he was left with a strange feeling. A sense that something important was waiting for him. Something that might change his life. Driving away, Jonathan replayed the words he had once spoken to Emily. "You always taught me to help people, to look for those in need. Maybe that's where I'll find meaning." He sighed as he settled into his car. He didn't yet know if he was ready to follow that thought, but something inside him whispered that change was inevitable. New York was drenched in a torrential downpour, as if the heavens had decided to spill all their sorrow over the city. Jonathan walked along the street with his coat collar turned up, carrying an umbrella in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. Raindrops drummed against the umbrella, muffling the noise of passing cars. He paid little attention to the pedestrians around him, lost deep in thought. His day had been as gray as the weather. Endless meetings, routine reports, and a constant stream of emails had turned into a monotonous ritual he performed on autopilot. Loneliness shadowed him everywhere, even in a crowd. More and more, Jonathan found himself questioning why he kept clinging to this endless cycle. As he approached the subway station, something caught his attention. By the wall, seeking shelter from the rain, sat a woman with a child. She looked exhausted, her long blonde hair damp and her clothes soaked through. The infant in her arms cried, and she struggled desperately to soothe them. "Please help," she said, her voice soft and almost lost in the sound of the rain. Jonathan stopped and glanced at her. She looked young, barely older than 25. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. At first, he felt a flicker of irritation. There were many like her on the city's streets, and he'd trained himself to ignore them. But something in her gaze held him. It wasn't just a plea for help. There was a deep, almost hopeless pain in her eyes. He stepped closer, pulling out his wallet. "Here, take this," he said, handing her a few bills. "It should help you get a hotel or buy some food." She looked up, her expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered. "This is more than I expected." Jonathan nodded and was about to walk away when her words froze him in place. Emily would have done the same. He turned back, his heart skipping a beat. "What did you say?" he asked, trying to convince himself he hadn't misheard. The woman looked startled, as if realizing she had said too much. I'm sorry," she stammered, turning away and clutching her child closer. Jonathan stood there, staring at her. The name of his late wife, spoken by a complete stranger, echoed in his mind. This couldn't be a coincidence. He wanted to ask her more, but at that moment the infant began crying again, and the woman hurriedly retreated into the subway station, disappearing from view. Left standing in the rain, Jonathan felt a strange unease rising in his chest. Who was she? And why had she mentioned Emily? He glanced again in the direction she had gone, but she was already gone. His mind raced through possible explanations. A coincidence? But he knew Emily had always drawn people in with her kindness. Could this woman somehow be connected to her past? Jonathan couldn't shake the encounter from his thoughts. The next day, he returned to the cemetery, as he did every week, to tell Emily what had happened. But as he approached her grave, he froze, seeing a familiar figure. The same woman stood before the headstone, shielded by an old umbrella. The child was still in her arms. His heart clenched. She knew Emily. He took a step forward and hesitated, unsure of what to say. Sensing his presence, she turned. Their eyes met, and her expression showed a mix of surprise and apprehension. "You again," she said softly, her voice gentle but anxious. "I need to know how you knew my wife," Jonathan said, his voice steady but not harsh. "Emily. She meant everything to me." The woman hesitated, as if deciding whether to speak. "My name is Rachel," she finally said. "And your wife once saved my life." Rachel's words hit Jonathan like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. He stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she had just said. "Emily saved you," he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "When? How?" Rachel adjusted the infant in her arms, her gaze flickering between Jonathan and the gravestone. It seemed as though she was searching for the right words to explain. "It was years ago," she began softly. "I was a different person back then. Lost, broken. I had nothing, no home, no family, no hope. I was sleeping in a park when your wife approached me." Her voice trembled, and she paused, as if the memories were too vivid and overwhelming. Jonathan listened intently, his breath caught in his throat, his heart racing. He knew Emily was kind and compassionate, but this story revealed an entirely new depth to her character. "She just sat down beside me," Rachel continued after a moment. "At first, I was scared. I thought she was going to tell me to leave or something worse. But she didn't. She handed me a bottle of water and a bag of food. Then she asked me my name. I didn't understand why she cared. But she didn't leave, even when I told her I didn't want anything." Rachel averted her gaze, her face a mixture of gratitude and pain. "She asked me what I wanted most. And I told her. I told her I just wanted to disappear because, back then, I thought my life had no meaning. But she didn't give up on me. Emily sat with me for hours, listening to my story, even crying with me. Then she offered to help. Jonathan stood frozen, emotions surging through him in waves. It hurt to hear Rachel's story, but at the same time, it filled him with pride. Emily had truly been one of a kind. She gave me money, Rachel continued, her voice growing quieter. Not just a few dollars, but enough to rent a room and start over. She said she believed in me, that I could turn my life around. Rachel glanced down at the baby in her arms, her lips trembling into a faint smile. Without her, I wouldn't have survived. And this little one, he wouldn't be here either. Jonathan looked at Rachel, speechless. Memories of Emily flooded his mind, making his chest ache. He had always known how generous she was, but he could never have imagined how profoundly she had touched others' lives. "Why are you here at her grave?" he finally asked. Rachel lowered her eyes, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the old blanket wrapped around her child. "I found out about her passing from the news," she said quietly. "I couldn't come to the funeral then. I was too ashamed. But now that I have my son, I realized I needed to thank her. She gave me a chance at life, and her voice broke, and she took a deep breath. I wanted to tell her that I'm doing my best to be worthy of the faith she had in me." Rachel's words struck Jonathan deeply. A bittersweet feeling filled him, grief over losing Emily intertwined with gratitude for the legacy she had left behind in the lives she touched. "She would be proud of you," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Proud of how far you've come." Rachel nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're proud of her too, aren't you?" Jonathan turned to look at Emily's gravestone. His gaze lingered on the engraved letters of her name. "More than words can ever express," he replied quietly. Silence fell between them, undisturbed even by the gentle patter of rain. They both stood there, connected by their memories of a woman who had changed their lives. "I want to know more," Jonathan said, turning to Rachel. "More about what she did for you. If you're willing to share." Rachel looked surprised, but then nodded slowly. "Of course," she said. "I'll tell you everything I can." Returning home after meeting Rachel, Jonathan felt as though he were under a spell. Everything she had shared about Emily's kindness opened his eyes to a woman he thought he knew completely. His wife had always been loving, caring, and genuine, but her actions, it turned out, had reached far beyond what he had ever imagined. In his study, Jonathan pulled out an old box from a drawer, its surface coated with a thin layer of dust. It had sat there for years, a silent keeper of memories from the time when Emily was alive. Inside were her personal belongings, journals, letters, photographs. Carefully, he opened the first journal and began to read. March 7, 2018. "Today, I saw a girl in the park. Her eyes, they spoke more than words ever could. Hunger, exhaustion, emptiness. I couldn't just walk past her. I sat down beside her. At first, she didn't want to talk, but then her voice cracked, and the words started flowing. Her name was Rachel. She had lost everything, her family, her job, her home. I didn't know if I could help her, but I promised she wouldn't be alone. I gave her money so she could rent a place and my phone number. I hope she calls." Jonathan froze, his eyes lingering on the line. "I didn't know if I could help her." Emily had often doubted herself, even though her heart and actions told a different story. He flipped through more pages. Each journal was filled with similar entries, stories of people Emily had helped. A man she helped get a job through a friend. A family she delivered groceries to during a harsh winter. A young woman from a shelter whom Emily helped find vocational training. Emily hadn't just been kind, she had lived her kindness. She had changed lives, creating the world she dreamed of one small act at a time. The letters in the box also caught his attention. Among them were thank-you notes and cards. One stood out. "Dear Emily, thank you for not walking past me. Thank you for seeing a person in me, even when I stopped believing it myself. Your kindness changed my life. With love, Rachel." Jonathan stared at the note, the words echoing in his mind. He began to understand that Emily's death hadn't ended her impact on the world. She continued to live on through the lives she had touched. The next morning, Jonathan met Rachel at a cafe near the cemetery. She was sitting at a corner table, holding her infant. When she saw Jonathan, she gave him a faint smile. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat across from her. Jonathan placed one of Emily's journals on the table. "I've been reading her journals," he said. "About you. And others. I never knew just how remarkable she was." Rachel looked at the journal with surprise. "She wrote about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Jonathan replied. "She wrote about your conversation in the park, about how she wished she could do more." Rachel lowered her gaze, her eyes welling with tears. "She did more for me than anyone ever had. I was ready to give up, and she gave me hope." Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of her words resonate within him. "Rachel," he began cautiously, "I need to know something else. Your child. Did Emily know about him?" Rachel hesitated before nodding. "Yes," she admitted. "When I found out I was pregnant, I went back to her. I was terrified. I didn't think I could provide for a baby. Emily convinced me that I had a choice, that I could give him life. She helped me find a shelter where I could stay during my pregnancy. And she supported me when I decided to give him up for adoption." Jonathan was stunned, struggling to process her words. "So your son, he's not with you?" he asked gently. Rachel shook her head. "No. I gave him to a good family. It was the best decision for him, but not a day goes by that I don't think about him." The baby in her arms began to fuss, and she rocked him gently before adding, "But this little one, he's my second chance." Later that evening, back at home, Jonathan opened the box again. Among the journals, he found a small envelope he hadn't noticed before. Inside was a letter from Emily, addressed to him. "Dear John, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I don't want you to live in grief or regret. You have a good heart, and I've always loved your desire to help others. Keep doing that. Find those who need you. You'll be surprised at how much it heals you. With love, Emily." Her words felt like a sign. Jonathan knew he had to do something more. Rachel had spoken of the child she had given up for adoption. Where was he now? What had his life been like? The question lingered in Jonathan's mind, and he realized he couldn't let it go. He had to find the answer. Jonathan couldn't shake the restless energy that had consumed him since meeting Rachel and reading Emily's journals. Rachel's story about the son she had placed for adoption ignited a burning desire within him to uncover the boy's fate. He saw this as another way to honor Emily's memory, by helping someone who had meant so much to her. That evening, Jonathan called his brother, Mark. As a private investigator, Mark was known for his uncanny ability to find people in even the most challenging circumstances. After a few rings, Mark's familiar voice came through. "John, what's going on? You don't usually call out of the blue." "I need your help," Jonathan said, his chest tightening with a mix of anxiety and determination. "It's about Emily, and a woman she saved." There was a pause on the other end. Despite their frequent differences, Mark had always respected Emily deeply. "Go on," Mark said finally. Jonathan recounted Rachel's story, her connection to Emily, and the child she had given up for adoption. "I need to find him, Mark," Jonathan concluded. "I need to know how he's doing. He deserves a chance to know the truth if he wants it." Mark sighed, his tone serious. "You know this won't be easy, right? Adoption records in New York are heavily protected for privacy. I know, Jonathan replied. But if anyone can do this, it's you. A week passed, each day dragging on as Jonathan waited for news. Finally, late one evening, his phone rang. "John, I have something," Mark said. His voice was steady, but there was a trace of triumph in it. "I found him." Jonathan's heart raced. "His name is Joshua Whittaker," Mark continued. "He's 22, living in Newton, a suburb of Boston. His adoptive parents are a wonderful couple, a doctor and a teacher. He's in his final year of college, studying psychology." Jonathan closed his eyes, relief and apprehension washing over him in equal measure. "You're sure it's him?" he asked, barely able to contain his emotions. "Positive," Mark replied. "The birth mother's name in the records matches Rachel's, along with the birth date. It's him. But John, be careful. This is his life. He might not even know he's adopted." Jonathan nodded, even though Mark couldn't see him. "Thanks, Mark. I'll handle it from here." The next day, Jonathan drove to Boston. The journey was filled with nervous anticipation. What would he say to Joshua? How would he explain everything? And what if Joshua didn't want to know? These thoughts swirled in his mind until he arrived in Newton, a quaint town with quiet streets and charming homes. He found the address Mark had provided. The house was modest but well kept, with a green lawn and bicycles leaning against the porch. Sitting in his car, Jonathan watched as a young man stepped out of the house. Tall, with dark hair, Joshua bore an uncanny resemblance to Emily. The resemblance was heart-wrenching and comforting at once. Summoning his courage, Jonathan got out of the car and approached. Joshua was unlocking a bicycle when Jonathan called out, "Excuse me, are you Joshua Whittaker?" The young man turned, surprised by the stranger's presence. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" Jonathan stepped closer, speaking as calmly as he could. "My name is Jonathan Harris. I was a friend of your biological mother." The words hung in the air. Joshua froze, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Biological mother?" he echoed. "You must be mistaken. I know my parents." "This is a complicated story," Jonathan said gently. "But if you're willing to listen, I'd like to explain." Joshua hesitated, studying Jonathan before nodding and gesturing toward the house. Inside, in a cozy living room filled with warm light, Jonathan shared everything. He spoke about Rachel, her struggles, and how Emily had helped her during her darkest moments. He explained Rachel's decision to place Joshua for adoption, always with the hope that he would have a better life. Jonathan spoke carefully, leaving room for Joshua's questions. When he finished, Joshua sat in silence, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me that my parents aren't really my parents?" he finally asked. "They are your parents," Jonathan said softly. "They raised you, loved you. But Rachel is your biological mother, and she's never forgotten about you." Joshua ran his hands through his hair, as if trying to make sense of everything. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Why now? What do you want from me?" Jonathan sighed. "I don't want anything," he said. "But this was important to Emily. She always believed in helping people find their way. And I think she'd want you to know the truth." Joshua stared out the window, his thoughts clearly racing. Finally, he said, "I need time. This is a lot." "I understand," Jonathan said. "If you ever want to meet Rachel, I can help arrange it." Back in New York, Jonathan felt a sense of relief. He had taken the first step, but he knew this was only the beginning. The next move was up to Joshua. For now, all Jonathan could do was wait and hope that the truth would bring the young man the clarity and connection he deserved. A week had passed since Jonathan's meeting with Joshua, and the young man's silence weighed heavily on his mind. Jonathan began to second-guess his decision to reveal the truth. But one evening, His phone rang. "Mr. Harris?" "This is Joshua." The voice on the other end was quiet but steady. "I'm ready to meet Rachel." Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I'll arrange everything. Thank you for making this decision." The meeting was set at a small cafe on the outskirts of New York. Rachel arrived first, nervously fidgeting with her hair as her infant slept peacefully in a stroller beside her. When the door opened and Joshua stepped in, she froze. He was taller than she had imagined, with a confident posture and a calm, steady gaze that reminded her of the days when she had just started rebuilding her life. Jonathan, standing a few steps behind Joshua, gave them space, settling at a nearby table. Joshua approached Rachel and took the seat across from her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. "Hi," Rachel finally said, her voice trembling. You're all grown up." "Hi," Joshua replied. "Are you my mother?" Rachel nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes. But I know this must feel strange. I gave you up so you could have a better life. And it looks like you've had one." Joshua sat in silence, processing her words. Then he asked, "My parents are wonderful people. They've given me everything. But why did you make that decision?" Rachel looked away for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I was young, scared, and completely alone. I couldn't give you the life you deserved. But I've thought about you every day since. I always hoped you were happy." Her words touched Joshua. He nodded, acknowledging the difficulty of her choice. "Thank you for being honest," he said. "That means a lot to me." They began to talk. Rachel shared stories of her struggles, how Emily's kindness had given her a second chance, and how she had always hoped that Joshua would find happiness. In turn, Joshua recounted memories of his childhood, the love of his adoptive parents, and his decision to study psychology to help others. With every word, the barriers between them began to crumble. This wasn't just a reunion of a mother and son, it was a moment where past and present merged, laying the foundation for a shared future. Jonathan watched from afar, witnessing the bond forming between them. His heart swelled with quiet pride. Emily would have been overjoyed to see this. As the meeting came to an end, Joshua approached Jonathan. "Thank you," he said, extending his hand. "I never would have known the truth without you." "This isn't my doing," Jonathan replied, shaking his hand. "It's all thanks to Emily." In the months that followed, Jonathan continued to support Rachel. He helped her secure a new job and find a larger home for her growing family. Joshua became a regular presence in her life, slowly but steadily building the relationship they had missed out on for so many years. For Jonathan, this journey brought a profound shift in his perspective on grief. He realized that Emily's legacy wasn't confined to memories of her. It lived on in the lives she had touched and the kindness she had spread. A year later, Jonathan stood at an event celebrating the launch of a charitable foundation he had established in Emily's memory. Rachel, her children, Joshua, and many others whose lives Emily had impacted were present. Her spirit filled the room. When Rachel raised a toast, her voice was strong and steady. "This day is dedicated to the woman who changed so many of our lives. But it's also a day for those who continue her work. Thank you, Jonathan, for keeping her light alive." Jonathan lifted his glass, his eyes lingering on Emily's portrait displayed at the center of the hall. "This is for you, Em," he whispered, a soft smile on his face. The story ended on a note of hope and new beginnings. Jonathan had found renewed purpose in life, and Emily's memory continued to inspire others to embrace kindness and create meaningful change.